taller than me. You're taller than me.
I don't know what to say. If you want, I can fucking saw the legs off the chair. You'll have to buy the chair.
You've always had that sense of humor? Always.
No.
So,
Anyway.
Okay, so here, we are with the wonderful Jimmy Grimes. And everybody in this town knows him. Great personality, loved by everybody. Graham Marshall for, what, 2 years ago? Well,
2 years.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
2 years ago. We have your speech. You were funny. You were great during your speech. We have that kind of recorded. And but the reason we're here with you is you are definitely one of the greatest historians who knows more about the origins of Montauk and the migrations of those that came down from Newfoundland and those who came from Montreal.
No, not really very many from Newfoundland.
No?
No, I don't know anybody from Montreal. No.
So share what you
You're
do
sort
know.
of fucking this up already. No. Listen, Montauk's history
Yeah.
is fairly long, okay? Going back to 1640 when East Hampton was settled, the proprietors, which were basically the first families of East Hampton, negotiated and purchased Montauk in several different transfers from the natives. They bought Montauk. They bought it more or less what you'd call in common, okay, which meant no individual owned a lot or a piece of ground. It was owned collectively, okay, and that collective ownership entitled the shareholders to a given number of sheep, cattle, or horses to be grazed on Montauk. And it lasted like that until really the 1880s. And then I believe it was in 1882, Arthur Benson bought Montauk from the proprietors. It was kind of a convoluted sale. Some of the issues with Montauk spanned many years, okay, because there's confusion. I'm one of the East Hampton trustees. For many years, people would say, oh, Montauk was owned by the East Hampton trustees. Montauk was never owned by the East Hampton trustees. It was owned by the proprietors, okay, and the proprietors, for the most part, were the East Hampton trustees, but as time went on, more, I want to say, non-locals or not part of the original settlers moved into town, and they made up the sort of demographic complexion of the proprietors. And through a couple of lawsuits, I think it might have been 1851, the proprietors basically wrestled and definitively established their ownership. What ended up happening is ultimately Arthur Benson buys Montauk, okay? A lot of people say it's Arthur Benson from Bensonhurst, Queens. He was a developer. No, Arthur Benson was an oil guy, okay? He was an oil guy that got bought out by the Rockefellers, like most of the other oil guys. He had a ton of money, came out here, bought Montauk, was an avid sportsman and hunter. And what he loved about Montauk was that bucolic beauty. That was the country that was wild. And he built what's known as the Seven Sisters houses, which were designed by Stanford White, which were laid out by Olmsted, created this little summer community out here back in, this was, I guess, the 1880s, 1890s. Well, what happened is Arthur croaked, okay? Arthur probably would have fucking been appalled at Carl Fisher's dreams for Montauk, because you know what? Arthur Benson really, as an individual, wanted to keep it the way it was, but he had a son who didn't share the same beliefs. So as soon as Arthur was in the ground, the son got to work trying to establish Montauk as a deep water commercial port, almost like a mini New York harbor. And For whatever reasons, unfortunately, that never really came to fruition. Years later, fast forward, Carl Fisher comes along. He buys the Benson estate and owns the land. It wasn't until Arthur Benson bought Montauk that you could basically whack pieces off. And Arthur Benson really didn't do it during his tenure. And that span of time between, let's say, the 1880s and 1923, when Carl Fisher came, was when my family sort of crept into this scene, okay? What happened between the 1880s and 1923? A couple major things. One, the railroad came out here. Part of young Benson's ideas on the Deepwater port and Corbin, who was the head of the Long Island Railroad, was to get the train out here, and they did. Once they got the train out here, well, now you had the means to ship fish and stuff. In sort of the bigger scheme of things, during this late 1800s period, early 1900s period, the cod fishery up in Nova Scotia essentially collapsed. Okay, you mentioned Newfoundland earlier. Newfoundland was part of that ultimate cod fishery collapse. It coincided with the end of wooden boats, okay, because that was another big industry up in Nova Scotia. So you had all of these French Acadians that found themselves somewhat destitute in search of finding a new home, place to make a living, which was brought my great-grandfather and his brother down here from Nova Scotia. There's a whole friggin' history up there that starts in the 1630s, but I'll just deal with it.
And I think that's where I had it mixed up. It wasn't Newfoundland, it was Nova Scotia that you were saying.
And specifically, Ilmadam is where a lot of the families that originally settled Montauk all hailed from. So they originally, my great-grandfather and his brother came down here, I think it was about 1904, and they came down to work on the bunker boats with the Edwards boys, doing bunker fishing, okay? It was dirty, miserable work. I don't think they particularly liked it. What they would do is they'd come down here, work on the bunker boats for the summer, then go back to their families up in Nova Scotia for the winter time, and repeat the same process the following spring. Well, my great-grandfather Eli, fairly early on, bailed on the bunker fishing because he recognized that you had the train out here, you could ship your catch to New York. So he started trap fishing off the beach, right where if you get down to Fort Pond Bay now, you'll see several fish traps along there. That's what they were doing. They were trap fishing on the beach. They were doing what they knew, and they were shipping the fish into New York.
Talking about the Navy Beach side.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now they had,
that's where the town originally was before.
Well, there was there was really no town there. There was a semblance of a community there because there was a pier. There was a pier down there. You had E.B. Tuttle, okay, which they showed up, I'm not sure when. The Duryea family basically ended up becoming Duryeas because what happened is E.B. Tuttle split, and I think he just ran off on his wife. And Perry Duryea's dad showed up in town and basically stepped in, raised E.B. Tuttle's kids, married his wife, took over the business, and that was a whole different, set of events. But what ended up happening is they started trap fishing off the beach, which in turn led to a few more French Acadian families coming down here and duplicating the same thing. And just about the time they sort of got going, Carl Fisher showed up. And Carl Fisher brought something that was absolutely unique and new to everybody out here. Deep sea sport fishing, okay? He's coming from Miami. He's coming from that scene down there. He's bringing that golden age of fishing type crowd comes up here. They're going to make the Miami Beach in the north. They're looking for captains to run boats, guys that understand fishing. And some of my family hooked into that, literally. And they were sort of part of that initial going from harpooning swordfish in Block Island Sound to catching giant tuna in the same area, and got into the ultimately charter boat fishing in that. But the family had, since the 1600s, worked in commercial fishing, done cod fishing, done whatever they needed to do in Nova Scotia, which...
So I had a little bit wrong. I kind of understood Carl Fisher more as a real estate developer, but he was actually developing the fishing industry first.
Well, no, not really. No, that was more or less a sideshow. He was very much developing land. But, Carl Fisher was a guy that started out a lot like the Wright brothers with a bicycle shop, okay? He was a total motorhead, was into engines, was into speed, was trying to develop, was trying to set land speed records on motorcycles before, I don't even think you could really call them a motorcycle. Was so captivated by the European racing scene that he was convinced the only way the Americans could compete is if they could build a track to truly test engines, test drivetrains on. So what did he do? He built Indianapolis Speedway.
Yeah.
But Carl Fisher's claim to fame is he bought the patent to compress acetylene gas, which some people would say, what the hell does that have to do with the automobile industry? At the turn of the century, when cars were first coming into play, they didn't have electric headlights. They had carbide headlights.
Oh, right,
okay,
yeah.
These were coming from horse and buggy days. You took the technologies that you more or less were familiar with, and you applied them to this new technology, the automobile.
Yeah, that's right. The first place.
Say carbide headlights. This guy buys the patent at the most perfect time to compress acetylene gas and watches his business take off. But he was a guy that looked way into the future. He realized that, one, this was probably the most unsafe way of friggin' lighting the front of a car, because his own compression plans, they had several different incidents of fires, explosions. So he timed it perfect. He sold out of the company that he started, which was called Prestolite. He sold it to Union Carbide for an amount of money, and I'm not even sure what the amount of money was, but it was an amount that was astronomical for the time. Here's a young guy, 40 years old, I don't think he was even 40, who's loaded, goes to Miami Beach. I think it was the guy Flagler that owned a lot of the property in Miami Beach. The guy owned the property, but he didn't really have the marketing skills. He didn't have the financial wherewithal to make this work. And Carl Fisher basically organized this thing and made it happen. So he makes a ton of money in real estate in Miami Beach. Almost as fast as he makes it there, he loses his ass in a real estate bubble. Takes him about 6 years to make this back. And when he's sort of fat and flush again, he starts looking for something else to do. Comes up here. I don't know what led him to come to Montauk, but he did, and he bought what was that Benson estate, and had the idea that what I'm going to do is I'm going to develop Miami Beach of the North up here and create this wonderful playground for the rich to rival Newport or any of these other places. And it was a great idea. Little, again, tough timing, because it wasn't long after. He buys the Montauk in 23, starts developing it in 24. By 28, he's got the Montauk Manor built, he's got the surf club built, he's got the golf course built, with the plans to build another golf course over in what we call the President Streets now. He's on the move, man. And what he wasn't prepared for, but he did have a contingency plan for, was the stock market crash. When the stock market crash happened in 1929, he got basically beat up like everybody else did. And his company, post that, more or less just limped along. But when he bought Montauk, was rocking and rolling here. Well, you had a bunch of French Acadians roaming around that were fishing and stuff. They know a guy who knows carpentry, which is a guy, their cousin or brother or a relative that was a boat builder. So we had this other influx of these French Acadians with other people that came here to work, not just in the fishing industry, but to work on constructing the manor, constructing that, right here where I live.
Your grandfather.
The neighborhood. No, my grandfather
was
came.
Part of that worked with call fishing.
He did, but he didn't come down here. He came down here in 1918 just to get away from a father that he didn't get along with, who was a blacksmith. Okay, came from a fairly decent family, I'd say middle class. My great-grandfather there, what he did was he was a blacksmith. Yes, he shoed horses and things like that. He built wagons. But what he also did is he did a lot of the fixtures on cod schooners and that. There's a lot of smithing work that goes into building a boat. He decided he needed to get away from Dad, came down here in 1918, again, to work in the bunker boats. He meets my grandmother's brother, Murdoch, who was bunker fishing at the time, who introduces him to my grandmother. I don't know that they really hit it off right away. She was, I think, dating Jimmy Martell Sr. at the time. But you know what it definitely coincided with is he goes back to Canada. Well, he no sooner gets back to Canada and Prohibition starts. So, okay, here's a guy who knows the waters between Nova Scotia and New York. He knows fishing. He knows sailing, knows how to navigate. So him and some buddies, they have all of these cod schooners that are just sitting moored off in these harbors up where the family's from. So him and his buddies cob together gear off of different boats, get a boat somewhat seaworthy. They sail it up to St. John's, Newfoundland. They load it up with whiskey. They come down here. Worked great. Okay, they get down here. They unload the liquor. They take the boat off the beach. They scuttle it. They row back into shore. They take the train back up to Nova Scotia. And they put together another one of these boats.
So hold on a sec. So some friends of mine, we were looking at Claudio's up on the North Shore, went up for sale. So we got the tour of it and talked about the bringing in liquor from Canada. So they showed us the trap door underneath the bar so that the boats would come in and at low tide they could come underneath it. They'd load the liquor up through the trap door and then close it and the boats would go out. But at high tide, you'd never know. And then Joe Kennedy, he made all of his money being a smuggler in the beginning.
Well, yeah, hey, the deal is, here were people, they weren't citizens of the U.S., okay? They didn't look at, they weren't citizens of the U.S., they came from, my grandfather, my whole family comes from a long line of smugglers going back to the mid 1600s, early 1700s. They were no strangers to this kind of work because those coastal shipping back and forth had gone on pre the Revolutionary War, when England was at it with France, and that there was always exchange and trade that went on illegally. So these guys running liquor down from Canada wasn't something that I don't think was really thought as being that illegal. You know, we're just running a little bit of liquor. So they did this. It worked out pretty good. That whole industry was taken off. The Coast Guard got better at interdicting these shipments. And as the Coast Guard got better, the smuggling enterprise got far more organized. My grandfather said he never worked for organized crime, but at one point he was running, he wasn't just out here, he's running these cigarette boats back and forth from offshore. He runs into New Jersey. They didn't have really good radios or anything like that. A lot of your stuff was done by little light signals or whatever. And my grandfather didn't get arrested once. Yeah. He actually got nailed several times during Prohibition. Yeah. But that in turn, there was everybody was into it out here at the time. And during the same period, the sport fishing industry kind of took off, and there was back and forth. There were guys that were fishermen during the day and were running liquor at night. There were farmers that were farmers during the day and ran liquor at night. I mean, we never grew any field crops in Montauk except during the 1920s. Down along Westlake Drive, there were several fields that they grew potatoes in. And the only reason they grew potatoes in those fields down there was to cover up the liquor that was in the trucks and to give some legitimate reason for those trucks coming past Amagansett.
Whatever it's going to take.
Yeah, so that's kind of the ins and outs about how my family got here. My dad grew up working on charter boats and that, him and Carl Damberg and a whole bunch of other guys. During the late 40s and 50s. He went into the Navy. He got out of the Navy, came back here with my mom and my brother, and was going to continue in the charter boat business, but it's a tough way to make a living. And he was the first one since the late 1600s to not be a fisherman. He got out of it. And he was very careful about keeping me and my brother out of it. He never wanted us to get into the fishing deal.
You know what's amazing to me? It fascinates me. It's time and how it wasn't that long ago that things were so different. And some of these changes, you talked about the bunker boats, and my grandfather lived to be 100, and the last couple of years before he died, I did these interviews with him, kind of like I'm doing with you a little bit, and then when he was a kid, you rode a horse or you walked. The car hadn't been invented yet, but before he died, we were shuttling people with the space shuttle up through the clouds and landing on the moon. I was like, wow, look at that, what a short period of time that was. So your family came down and was dealing with bunker boats, and look how quickly we come here. And your grandfather had worked with Carl Fisher and the development of that. But then at the same time, I heard your dad's oral history in the library. Great stuff. But he talked about Peter Beard. So you hear about, it seems like these are generations apart, but they weren't that far apart.
Well, it was funny. Peter Beard, God, when did he show up here? I think it was late 60s, early 70s. No, it had to have been like mid-70s, because I was in college when he showed up in town. But he was a guy, came from a pretty well-connected family. Came out here, he buys this property out by the point. He marries Cheryl Teagues, the model.
Yeah.
But he buys the house that my father, not that he was born in, because my dad was born in my great-grandmother's house right over here in Shepherd's Neck. But my grandfather was the caretaker on the McCaffrey estate house that was over in Ditch Plains. And that in itself is kind of a bizarre story, because Walter McCaffrey builds that house. He's a big-time stockbroker in New York. He was actually the guy that was more or less responsible for the Catholic Church in Montauk. And the way that happened is, close friend of his was this Monsignor Chidwick, I believe it was, who was the chaplain on the USS Maine, which, remember the Maine, which was what started the Spanish-American War. The Maine went down in Havana Harbor. It probably was accidental, but it fit the narrative that it was sabotage, and we went into the Spanish-American War. Well, at one of the anniversaries post the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt brought his troops here from the Rough Riders to recuperate and stuff from the war. They did a commemorative thing where they brought the North Atlantic Fleet into Fort Pond Bay. Well, this Monsignor Chidwick was, because of his involvement with the Spanish-American War, he goes out and says Mass on the deck of this cruiser out in Fort Pond Bay. Well, there's like 60 families that were living along Fort Pond Bay in what was called the fishing village go out to Mass. And he says, well, he gets talking to someone that's like, guys, man, you got enough people here. Why don't you have a church in Montauk of your own? Well, these were all pretty simple people, man. Nobody really had any money to speak of. So he gets talking to him, and he said, hey, listen, if you can raise the money to build a church, I will get the Diocese of Brooklyn, because there was no Diocese of Rockville Center yet. I'll get the Diocese of Brooklyn to provide a priest. Well, that set the stage for Carl Fisher donates the property for the church as well as the Presbyterian Church. And because of, I guess you'd call it Catholic guilt, the money to build the church was kind of raised in record time. And that's how the church got started out here. Was, one day, chance meeting, somebody that had a little juice. Remember the musical O Calcutta?
Sure.
Norman Keane, I think, was the producer or whatever.
Kind of controversial, I remember.
Okay. Well, Norman Keane also was the guy that beat his wife to death, and then basically did the same thing that Walter McCaffrey did. He jumped off the roof of his building in the city. Okay. And he briefly owned the house that Peter Beard bought. So Peter Beard buys the house, has it moved out to the point, tries to make a house out of it, and then mysteriously the windmill burned before they could quite finish things. But, I know Peter's widow still lives out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the house didn't burn. It was just the windmill house that was a little offset from it. But, yeah.
You're not talking about Cheryl Teagues.
Yes.
So Cheryl's still out there?
No, Cheryl Teagues and Peter broke up years ago. She still owned the property. There was some arrangement with Peter where he could always stay there.
So something else that I love, and you just mentioned the Martells, the names of the people out here, the amount of generations that people go back. We did an interview with Cliff Bennett, And so the Bennetts and how far back they go. But something I love that Montauk still has, the generations of generations of generations that have been here and developed it, and the history of it. A lot of other places don't have that. People come and go, and families start and they move. But Montauk still has that feeling
but you
of...
got to realize, talking to one of the Bennetts, or the Lesters, or the Millers, or the Talmadges, and they'll be the first ones to tell you, no, we've been here for 13 generations
Yeah.
plus.
Yeah.
Which is pretty, you think about it. That means your family was in the New World. Let's not call it the U.S. Your family was in the New World before there was a U.S.
Right. How crazy.
Before there was a
Amazing.
Canada. Okay? And that's where sometimes we, myself, we forget about it. My grandmother's maiden name was Pettipaw, which is a Basque name, okay? Her great-great-great-grandfather, going back to the 1639, was the notary public for the first French settlement in the New World, okay, Port Royal. Now, the Martel family is another very old family in Nova Scotia. Joyce, another old family. Joyce is not Joyce. It's not Irish. It's Joss''E.
Oh, yeah?
It's a Basque name.
Ah.
Okay.
See, that's why we love Jimmy. All these fun facts.
Okay. The Landrys, the Brians, the Poiriers, the Marchands. These were all families that went way back to, the 1600s, 1700s in Nova Scotia. They were part of, we don't read it, we don't hear about it in American history because it didn't occur in America. Okay, but leading up to the French and Indian War, there was a little ethnic cleansing thing. The British were famous for like cleaning house. Well, coming up onto the French and Indian War, even though these French Acadians had been under English rule for, Christ, it was more than 50 years. They were British citizens or British subjects. They were considered British subjects at the time. New king, we want you to basically swear an oath of fealty to the king, to the new king. Okay, now in the years past, the French Acadians, as part of that oath of allegiance, they couldn't, in good conscience, say that they would take up arms against the king's enemies. Who are the king's enemies? The French are the king's enemies. These people are French. The natives, the Indians, are the king's enemies. Well, almost all of the French Acadian families found themselves married into the maritime tribes, the Micmac, the Abenaki, the Malisettes and stuff. And it was just simply because, unlike the Iroquois and some of the other tribes, the Micmac were very amenable to religion. Everybody looks at the Cajuns of Louisiana and says, oh, they came from the Minas Basin in Nova Scotia and they went to Louisiana. No, they didn't. That's where they ended up. These people found their way to Louisiana over an 8-year period and ultimately went there because if you were Catholic in the 1700s, you could not exist in Boston. You couldn't exist in New York. Philadelphia, the friggin' city of brotherly love. Yeah, they'd love the shit out of you as long as you weren't friggin' Catholic. You could be Jewish. You were safe. Catholic was a bad deal. So these people, a lot of them found their way to New Orleans, which at that time was a Spanish possession.
Not
because
French.
It was settled by the French, and then through those many times with properties changed hands, it was given to the Spanish. At that time, it was Spanish. A lot of these French Acadian families did manage to get down to New Orleans. The Guidrys, my family were married into the Guidrys. They came from the Minas Basin in Nova Scotia and they went to Louisiana. No, they didn't. That's where they ended up. These people found their way to Louisiana over an 8-year period and ultimately went there because if you were Catholic in the 1700s, you could not exist in Boston. You couldn't exist in New York. Philadelphia, the friggin' city of brotherly love. Yeah, they'd love the shit out of you as long as you weren't friggin' Catholic. You could be Jewish. You were safe. Catholic was a bad deal. So these people, a lot of them found their way to New Orleans, which at that time was a Spanish possession.
Not French.
It was settled by the French, and then through those many times where properties changed hands, it was given to the Spanish. At that time, it was Spanish. A lot of these French Acadian families did manage to get down to New Orleans. The Guidrys, my family were married into the Guidrys. So to this day, every 5 years, there's a French Acadian reunion. There's one coming up this year in August, and they move it around. 5 years ago, it was down in Louisiana. But all the French Acadian families try and, not all of them, but a bunch of them get together and basically hash over history and relations and how people are connected with one another.
You seem to know more about the French coming down than anybody I know. Did the French go to Montreal and come down?
Well, the French settled in various places, but when you speak about French Canadians, when you say French Canadian, that's Montreal, that's Quebec, okay? The Maritime French, which were actually a little earlier, they settled the coastal areas there, and they were somewhat a separate entity as a people. And the consequence of that is, Montreal, Quebec, the French and Indian War, their plight was settled by a negotiated treaty. Okay. Unfortunately for the French Acadians, they didn't have that because you know what? By the time the French and Indian War came around, these people had been in Nova Scotia since some of them before the 1630s. Okay, they'd been there forever. They had been under English rule for a long time. They're well over 100 years. They're 2 to 3 generations. They may speak French, but they weren't really French. And when the English started to deport these people, some of them, the real rabble-rousers, they shipped back to France. Well, these people had no sort of, they had nothing there. There was no family there for them. Some of the French Acadians weren't even Catholic. They, like the Basques, my family, the Pettipas, the Joyces, the Decasses, they were Basques. Okay, what happened there? Like the Decasse family, a lot of them, they were Sephardic Jews.
Yeah.
Okay, when Spain ejected the Muslims, these people were screwed. They were in the same situation then that the families were leading up to the French and Indian War. They had no connection back in Africa. They'd been in Spain or the Iberian Peninsula for 150 years. So what did they do? Some of them, they hiked over the Pyrenees because at that time the Edict of Nantes protected them. They could be Jews in France, and it was cool. Well, then what happens? The Edict of Nantes gets repealed. So what are you going to do now? You sure shit ain't hiking back over the Pyrenees to Spain, because they were just going to kill you. So you converted. And then they start looking for people to go to the New World. Well, what the hell? I got nothing to lose. I'll go to the New World. And a lot of the Basques, when they were talking about going to the New World, there was nothing new about that. The Basques had been fishing Newfoundland, Nova Scotia area for 100 years before Columbus thought he discovered America.
Yeah.
You know, so there was like, it wasn't that big a deal, you know, to go over there. And, you know, hey, the French settled the North America differently than the English. You know, the English here, it was a religious persecution that drove whole families and whole communities to leave England to find a better thing. Well, when the French came here, it was strictly a business deal. They came here to earn a living. Okay, they came here to trade with the Indians, to buy furs, to do whatever, to codfish, to do whatever they were doing.
So the French were more friendly to the Indians.
Well, you know what they did? Like where my family was from, which was Port Royal. It's right on the Bay of Fundy. It's all of these estuary marsh, like grasslands and stuff. I don't know where they learned this back in Europe, but they knew how to dike the marshes, install one-way valves on them, which would allow the fresh water to flow into the ocean, but on an incoming tide would close the valve. So the salt, it would gradually flush the salt out of these areas, which made them great properties to graze cattle on. And eventually, as the soil got sweeter, you could grow crops on it. And in the 1740s, when they did this great deportation, this was all done by the families of Massachusetts, and that they wanted these little compact farms that were incredibly productive for the size of the farm. In the 1740s, Nova Scotia had the lowest infantile death rate of any of the colonies. The population was increasing faster than anywhere in the colonies, with the exception of Philadelphia. And it wasn't being done by immigration, it was being done by births, by breeding. And the reason being is these early families had a great diet. You know, here they were, they're eating beef, they've got shellfish, they've got good vegetables, they've, you know, they're eating fish. They had a much more diverse diet at that time than any of the other colonies. I mean, if you were, no matter where you were living, with the exception of maybe out here, you know, this area had somewhat of a unique situation, and that may have been part of the reason my family and some of these other families were attracted to this area, because it did remind them of home.
So the Indian tribe that the French kind of gravitated to, you mentioned their name before.
The Micmac.
The Micmac.
Or Mi'kmaq.
Yeah, I don't know much about them. I know that I dated a Shinnecock Indian priestess. She had a Presbyterian minister too, beautiful woman, and had a great time with her. And she was teaching me how the Shinnecock were Algonquinian.
Yeah,
Algonquins
so
came down. I love that word, Algonquinian.
Okay, but so were the Micmac.
The Micmac are Algonquinian.
See, the Iroquois were a different.
Yeah.
That was a different group.
I always think of Iroquois as like out west or something.
No, the Iroquois were, the Iroquois were really a nation. They were what? The Iroquois were composed of the Senecas, the Mohawks, the Onondaga.
The Mohawks and the Mohegans. The Mohegans were upstate New York.
Yeah.
The Mohawks, where the heck were they from?
They were upstate New York, but they went all of the what do you call it? The Iroquois were all the way out to the Huron, were Iroquois. It was a confederacy. They actually, when we set up, Benjamin Franklin was very intrigued by the Iroquois Confederacy. Yeah. And when the United States was being basically hashed about, to a point it was modeled. The confederation of tribes or of states was not like a European idea. That was coming from the Iroquois.
Yeah. But to the Montauk Manor, there's a park with a huge stone, and every day there was a big powwow place, and you had the Massapequa coming out, and all the tribes from Long Island came out, and everybody had this big, all the different, I guess they were families, right?
Well, you know what it was? It seemed like all of the different, the tribal groups, they were all Algonquin in nature. They were all related, and a lot of them very much were related because there was there was marriages that occurred between these groups, basically the same things that went on in Europe. In that is, it helped solidify good relations with the other groups. But where the Montauk Manor was built, that was Fort Hill. That was not an English fort, that was an Indian fort. And if you go up there and you stand at that cemetery and you look around, you can understand why. From that point, you could see across, and they weren't so much looking out to sea, they were looking across the bay because you had the Pequots, you had, there was a bunch of other.
That's right,
the Niantics, you had a whole bunch of these guys, and they all had similar languages, but they didn't all get along. Yeah. There was a lot of, intertribal battling and stuff that went on.
I forgot that the stone, there's a story about the stone in front of the Montauk Manor and on that Fort Hill. It's out of no place. It's a big, huge stone, like how it got there or some kind of magical properties or something, but it was there for the Indians and they all kind of circled around it.
I think the Indians, from what I've been told, and some of this comes from Lawrence Cook, which he's done way more reading on this stuff. Long Island, it's a composition, it's glacial by nature. So you have all of these rocks that were deposited by glaciers that were chipped off somewhere farther north from here, all the way up probably into Maine and that. And the Indians had some inherent respect for all of these things. And I got to tell you, there's parts of it that have always intrigued me because you can find these rocks. They call it Lost Boulder over in Hitherwoods. There's one of these big glacial erratics. It's maybe about half the size of this room. But what's kind of neat about it is you can actually see where that rock was exposed to the weather pre-getting broken off by the glacier. Yeah. You can see where the rock is weathered back 1.5 inches, almost 2 inches. And then you can see the portion of that rock that must have been buried. And now the rock's been sitting down here for 20,000 years or so, and there's been hardly any wearing or erosion or the other things. So it's kind of neat to see that. There's up in East Hampton, there's another one of those erratics that has a fern growing out of it called common polypody. It's nothing special, but
easy for you to say.
Okay. Well, common polypody, you'll see it in New England. You'll see it all through Connecticut, Massachusetts, and in these areas where there's ledge and stuff. I've never seen common polypody growing anywhere out here. Where do you see it growing? Out of this one glacial erratic. Now, this may be a reach. Did that friggin' plant come down from Maine or someplace with the fern? And is that fern still growing there thousands of years later? Because it's weird. I'm crawling around in the bushes out here all the time. I've never seen that plant growing anywhere else.
You are such a wealth of information. I talk to you forever. I don't know how long we've gone, but and I would just keep talking to you. But something that I just wanted to mention. So I love that you're so involved. I mean, even with the horticulture and the rocks and knowing everything. But so I find you. I went out that one night with you guys, and you're counting horseshoe crabs in the middle of the night. Tell us everybody about that. I love that you're involved with that, and you have that knowledge. It's guys like you that help protect our environment and help us, sustain ourselves. Hopefully.
How did I get into that? I'm on the East Hampton Board of Trustees, and about 10 years ago, we had somebody show up at one of our meetings and ask a question. They said, hey, I've been living out here for 30 years. It seems like there's fewer horseshoe crabs here now than 30 years ago. What can you tell me about that? All right, not a freaking thing. I don't have any answers, but it was an interesting question. So I contacted Cornell, who put me in touch with this guy, Matt Sclafani, who, lo and behold, has been studying horseshoe crabs for, I have no idea how long, but at this point he's been doing it at least 10 years, because it was 10 years ago that I talked to him. He goes, yes, we think there are fewer horseshoe crabs. In fact, we've been doing annual counts. We don't have anybody in East Hampton doing counts. Would you guys be at all interested in this? So a couple other people on my board and myself decided to volunteer for this, which we did. And like so many things, once you start doing it, it's kind of hard to stop. So for the last 8 years or so, I think I've been counting horseshoe crabs. Every spring, my area's Lazy Point, and there's about 1,000 linear foot of shoreline over there that I go out on every new and full moon, and I count the horseshoe crabs, and I tag crabs.
Yeah, we saw a picture of you tag.
And now you were out, you saw it where, a few years ago, it was a really big deal to find one of these tags that you had tagged before.
Yeah.
Well, now it's like this year, I think we finished out, I'm pretty sure we collected 27 crabs that we had previously tagged in previous years, which I thought was kind of neat. One.
Yeah, you bet. That's got to be fun.
One, you found something that you tagged up to 5 years ago. And two, they weren't dead. 3, they're coming back and breeding in the same spot. In fact, last year, I found 2 crabs, 2 consecutive numbers, and I do keep some records, that I had tagged the year before.
And consecutive numbers?
Within 100 feet of where I found them.
Yeah.
So not only do they come back to the same areas, sometimes they'll even come back to the same spot. Even though the animal is somewhat threatened, we counted more crabs this year than we ever. I think we had 4 nights that we had well over 1,000 crabs that we counted.
That sounds good.
It's good, but you know what? Well, New York State has just basically outlawed the taking of horseshoe crabs, because horseshoe crabs, there is a market for them. They're used as bait for conch and eel.
Really?
And what they're also used for is their blood.
Yeah.
It's
blue or
every
something.
pharmaceutical is checked for impurities using horseshoe crab blood, because their blood, unlike ours, which is iron-based, horseshoe crab blood is copper-based. It's
really?
Completely different sort of plant. There is a synthetic version of the horseshoe crab bloods. They don't really need to use horseshoe crabs anymore.
Over in Southampton, off Maiden Lane, there's Munns Point. There's a nice long pedestrian boardwalk that goes out, and I remember going out there every year, and there would be hundreds of horseshoe crabs
Sure.
on certain nights. You know, oh my God, look at this party these guys are having,
Yeah,
all on top
yeah.
of each other. And the last couple of years, I've gone over the same time of year, same kind of moon and everything, haven't seen them. But the thing that, so there could be that reason, you know, whether it's pollution or breeding habitat. But the thing that I couldn't figure out why, growing up over on Todd Point, which is right off North Sea and Little Peconic, grew up there, and there were these beaches, and we had the fiddler crabs. And growing up, it would be blankets of hundreds of thousands of them, all raising their claws and
all
everything.
trying to-
And now, hardly any of them. So they're not being caught for fishing. They're not.
No,
So
no.
where
I mean,
are
the
they
only thing
going?
you use, you know, that you'll use, you know, occasionally for bait and that, I don't know. You know, we see when we're out doing the horseshoe crabs, we do see fiddler crabs. But, you know, the thing I have to temper, whatever conclusions I'm coming to on things, I always got to realize I'm only looking at this through this little lens, this little short period of time.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to miss some things that are cycle, or actually to recognize the impacts that you may be having on something because you're looking at it through such a brief period of time. And you know, that's been an ongoing thing, not just here, almost anywhere. It's, you know, I moved to town and I notice there's fewer fiddler crabs. Oh, we've got to freaking stop whatever the hell is going on with the fiddler crabs, which it's very easy to draw conclusions out of something that you really don't understand. And that happens out here all the time.
Why these hundreds of thousands of fiddler crabs have kind of disappeared? It's like, what is that all about?
You know, and I hear it every day. Somebody calls me up and says, we've got to stop this. Whether it's fishing, whether it's hunting, whatever, why do we have to stop that? Well, the real reason is I'm here and I don't really like seeing somebody do that. Well, you know, but you're living in the community. You know, those people do that. It's sort of historic activity. Yeah, but I'm here now. And I'm telling you, you're living all wrong. I've got to save you from yourself. You know?
Yeah. Jimmy, listen, I'm loving this. Thank you, man. Thank you.
All right.
And also, listen, wait, just before you go, I'm one of these crazy people that actually does watch the town board meetings. And I watch you report all the time, and the amount of work you do for this town is really admirable. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And again, thanks for the time for this.
All right. Hey, thanks.